It's funny. Usually when we picture our own lives, we like to think of ourselves as the undisputed main character.
Oh, totally. Yeah, starting right there on page 1.
Right. You are born, the clock starts ticking, and every choice you make is yours alone. I mean, we have this deep cultural attachment to the idea of the blank slate.
It is the ultimate Western fantasy, really.
Yeah.
The idea that you are a completely independent actor, stepping onto a brand new empty stage. You get to build your house from scratch using only the materials you personally choose to pick up along the way.
But then you start digging into your family history. You start paying closer attention to the stories your grandparents told. Or maybe you start noticing the shape of the secrets they, desperately kept buried.
That's when the foundation cracks a little.
Exactly. And suddenly you realize something incredibly disruptive to that blank slate theory. Your page 1 actually started generations ago.
It's true.
We are not independent actors. We are the product of this massive, sprawling cast of characters. And the script they handed us is filled with both absolute glory and profound shame.
And if we don't learn how to read that script, we are practically guaranteed to unconsciously repeat it.
Wow. Yeah.
We will just stumble over the exact same lines and fall through the same trapdoors, which is exactly why we are so glad you are sitting here with us today.
Welcome to the Book Nook. This is the space dedicated to exploring the most impactful and transformative books in self-help, spirituality, psychology, and personal growth.
We are so thrilled to have you here. Yes, you listening right now.
Consider yourself the third person at this table as we embark on today's deep dive. We are unpacking a genuinely paradigm-shifting book today. It's called Translating Your Past by Michelle Van Loon.
And the mission for our conversation today is to really uncover the mechanics of this. How do our genetics, our history, and our family trauma act as a living prologue to our lives right now?
Right, because for a lot of people, when they look back at their family tree, it just sounds like static.
Yeah, just noise.
It looks like meaningless gibberish, just names and dates on paper. So we're going to explore how to stop hearing that static and start translating it into a language of healing, identity, and profound purpose.
Let's get right into the central metaphor of the entire book, which is this idea of translation.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Well, there is that famous Shakespeare quote from The Tempest, "What's past is prologue." Everyone knows it.
Sure.
But to actually understand a prologue that was written in a completely different time, under different circumstances, you have to become a translator. And translation is fascinating because it is both a hard technical science and a highly subjective art.
I love that distinction. The science part is what most people think of when they think of genealogy, right? It's the grammar and the vocabulary.
Exactly. It's digging up the census records, finding the ship manifests, verifying the birthdays and the geographic locations.
Right, the raw data.
Yes. But the art of translation is understanding the nuance. It's understanding the cultural idioms of the time, the emotional context, the unspoken pressures.
And if you only use the science and ignore the art, you end up with a complete misinterpretation of reality.
You really do.
There is this hilarious anecdote early on in the book that perfectly captures this. Imagine you are at a restaurant, maybe somewhere abroad, and you are looking at an English menu that has clearly been run through a very literal, rudimentary computer translation program.
Oh no, I've seen menus like this.
Right. So they are trying to offer jerk chicken, the classic Caribbean dish. But the program just looked at the raw vocabulary without any cultural context.
Sure.
So the literal word-for-word translation printed on the menu is chicken rude and unreasonable.
Which is incredibly funny, but it is the exact mechanism of a translation failure.
Totally.
The raw data points, the words were technically accurate in isolation. Jerk can mean rude, but the actual meaning of the dish was completely obscured.
Chicken rude and unreasonable.
Yeah. And when we do this with our family history, when we just look at the raw data of our grandparents' lives, without doing the artistic work of understanding their emotional context, we end up with chicken rude and unreasonable versions of our own ancestors.
Wow.
We judge them or misunderstand them based on literal readings of their actions.
And the cost of that misinterpretation can be devastating. To show how vital this work is, there's a deeply personal story from the author about her own mother.
It's a heavy one.
It is. Picture this. It's 2007. Michelle and her sister are going through old photo albums shortly after their mother passed away.
Very standard family history stuff, right?
Exactly. They were sorting through these classic black and white snapshots capturing the typical struggles and joys of their immigrant grandparents arriving in America. But tucked away, they discover a series of pictures of their mother as a child.
Pictures they had never, ever seen before.
Never seen them. Because those pictures represented a profound generational wound that her mother had tried to literally erase from the record.
Right. Michelle's mother was born to Eastern European Jewish immigrants. And in the years following World War II, there was immense societal pressure to assimilate.
Yeah, just intense pressure to fit in.
Like many young Jewish women in that specific era, her mother had undergone a rhinoplasty, a nose job, as a teenager. The explicit goal was to reduce the size of her nose so she wouldn't look so, quote-unquote, ethnic.
She was trying to carve herself into the modern American ideal of beauty to feel safe and accepted.
But the surgery didn't fix the internal wound. She was still profoundly unhappy with how she looked, so she had a second surgery.
Wow.
And the truly tragic part of this, the way generational trauma works, is how she unconsciously projected that deeply internalized self-hate onto her own daughter.
This part broke my heart. Growing up, Michelle's mom would frequently tell Michelle that she was unattractive.
Just brutal.
She actually promised Michelle that when she was old enough, they would get her a nose job to fix her appearance too. It wasn't just an idle threat. They went so far as to have a consultation with a plastic surgeon in Chicago when Michelle was just 15 years old.
Think about the psychological weight of that. When Michelle finally saw those hidden childhood photos of her mother decades later, it was a moment of profound translation.
Right.
It was like looking in a mirror. She realized that every time her mother looked at her, criticized her, or told her she needed to be fixed, her mother wasn't actually seeing Michelle.
She was seeing herself.
Exactly. She was seeing her own younger self. She was seeing the ethnic features she had tried so desperately and failed to emotionally erase.
But the cycle doesn't have to continue, and it didn't in this case.
No, it didn't.
Just a few months before that scheduled surgery in Chicago, 15-year-old Michelle experienced a massive paradigm shift. She came to a new faith, and she had this profound, grounding realization that she was loved by God exactly as she was, without needing to be physically altered to be worthy of that love.
It was a radical idea for her at the time, but she acted on it. She canceled the surgery. She broke the physical cycle of that specific inherited self-hatred.
Which is just incredible, and it brings us to how we actually frame the past.
Right.
If you look at ancient texts, particularly the biblical text, they model an incredibly intense, unflinching engagement with the past.
They do. The early church father Augustine actually referred to Scripture as our letters from home.
Letters from home, I like that.
And these texts are not polished public relations press releases. They don't sanitize the family history. They show the absolute messy complexity of human lineage.
The vocabulary the biblical writers use to describe the act of remembering is physically intense. It completely changes how you view memory.
How so?
Well, when we think of remembering, we usually think of recalling a fact, right? Like remembering where you left your keys or what year a war started. It's
Yeah.
just mental data retrieval. But take King David in the Old Testament. When he talks about remembering his history or his God, he uses the Hebrew word zakar. This doesn't mean recalling a fact. It means experiencing a past event as if it is actively happening right now in your body in the present moment.
That is a visceral, full-body experience.
Exactly.
And the texts use other words like haga, which translates to growling, moaning, or groaning, and sayak, which means complaining or deeply considering.
Remembering is portrayed as an active wrestle.
Yes. We see this carried forward into the New Testament as well. When Jesus institutes communion, he uses the Greek word anamnesis. Again, this isn't a passive mental nod to a past event. It is an active participatory remembrance that brings the past into the present reality.
Which is a completely countercultural concept for us today. I mean, you walk into the self-help section of any modern bookstore, and you are immediately bombarded with these highly individualized, one-size-fits-all blueprints for a happy life.
Oh, everywhere. Follow these 5 morning habits or think this specific way and you'll be successful.
Right. But those blueprints completely ignore the highly specific, sometimes deeply compromised building materials you were handed the moment you were conceived.
Yes, your specific genetics, your
Aw.
family's unhealed trauma, your geographic origins. It is an absurd way to build a life.
It really is. Trying to understand ourselves and build a functional life without first translating our specific history, it's like being handed a massive cardboard box containing 10 different 3,000-piece puzzles of French Impressionist paintings, all mixed together without the box covers.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
And then someone tells you, okay, build a 3D sculpture out of this.
You can't do it. You can't build a stable structure if you refuse to examine the specific materials you are holding. You have to sort the pieces.
But let me push back on this because I
Okay.
think a lot of people listening might be feeling a very natural resistance right now.
Sure.
If your past is incredibly painful, if your specific family history is full of severe dysfunction, physical abuse, neglect, or addiction, isn't avoidance actually the most rational, healthiest coping mechanism?
That's a very common perspective.
I mean, why would you purposefully grab a shovel and go dig up a graveyard? Sometimes things are buried for a reason.
That is the most common and understandable defense mechanism we have. The urge to flee from a painful history makes total sense from a survival standpoint.
If the stove is hot, you don't touch it.
Exactly. But psychological reality doesn't work like physical distance. Avoiding the past doesn't actually erase the past. It merely silences the lessons while the machinery keeps running in the dark.
So the pain doesn't just evaporate because you stop looking at it.
No, the pain submerges. It goes underground, and it
Yeah.
finds new, completely unconscious pathways for expression in your daily life.
Wow.
You might think you've outrun your father's anger because you moved across the country and don't speak to him. But ignoring the root of that history almost guarantees that you will carry its weight.
You'll just find yourself reacting with unexplainable rage when someone cuts you off in traffic.
Yes, or you'll have chronic tension in your body without ever understanding why. You have to translate the pain to diffuse it.
That reframes the whole idea of leaving the past in the past. It's not in the past. It's currently operating your nervous system.
Yes.
And this leads us to look at how different cultures actually handle this. Because this hyper-focus we have in the modern Western world on the individual, this idea that I am an island, is actually a massive historical anomaly.
It is entirely abnormal in the grand scheme of human history. Most other cultures have always centered the generational line, the collective family unit, rather than the isolated individual.
Like what?
For example, there's the Chinese Buddhist tradition of jiapu or zupu. These are incredibly detailed, meticulously maintained clan histories.
And what's fascinating about the Jiapu is how they functioned. Historically, they were heavily patrilineal, tracing the male line, and they were primarily compiled to glorify the ancestors.
So they are curated.
Exactly. Because of that, they were often highly edited. If an ancestor disgraced the family, committed a crime, or brought shame, they might be literally erased from the text. Tragically, a massive number of these ancient, irreplaceable documents were actively destroyed during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s as symbols of the old world.
But look at what's happening now. There is a massive modern resurgence in China and among the diaspora to painstakingly rebuild these family histories.
That's incredible.
The human drive to know where we fit into the long line of history is so powerful that it survives even state-sponsored destruction.
We see that same powerful drive in the profound African traditions of oral genealogies. There's this incredibly telling anecdote about Reverend Bernard Smith.
Oh, this story is great.
He's an American-born professor who has lived and taught in Togo for over 2 decades. And during a conversation, he casually admitted to one of his African students that he didn't know his great-grandfather's name. It was just a blank spot in his knowledge.
And the student's reaction was visceral. The student was utterly appalled.
Right.
He looked at Professor Smith and said, "If I didn't already know your character, I would have called you a liar. I have no idea how someone can live without that knowledge."
That is so telling. To the American professor, not knowing a great-grandfather's name is just a minor gap in trivia. It's a fun fact he doesn't happen to have.
Yeah.
But for that student in Togo, knowing your lineage is the very bedrock of your existence. If you don't know who you come from, you cannot possibly know who you are.
And what's amazing is that modern Western psychology is finally catching up to what these ancient cultures have always known. The psychological data completely backs this up.
Really, like hard data.
Yes.
Yeah.
Psychologists Robin Fivish and Marshall Duke from Emory University created a fascinating tool called the Do You Know scale. It's a 20-question scale designed specifically for children to measure how much they know about their family history.
And the questions aren't even about major historical traumas or deep, dark secrets, right? They are simple, everyday things.
Really simple.
They ask kids questions like, do you know where your grandparents grew up? Or do you know some things that happened to your mom or dad when they were in high school? Or do you know the source of your own name?
The mechanics of why this works are incredible. The researchers found that children who can answer these specific questions, children who know the mundane and detailed reality of their parents' and grandparents' lives, exhibit significantly higher self-esteem.
Wow.
They have a much stronger sense of familial connection and a higher internal locus of control.
But why does knowing where your dad went to high school give you higher self-esteem? What is the actual psychological mechanism there?
It creates an intergenerational self. When a child knows these stories, they realize they are part of a larger ongoing narrative. If the family narrative is strong, the child feels a sense of psychological safety.
They belong to something durable.
Exactly. Something that existed before them and will exist after them. It anchors them.
But the nuance here is critical. The writer Mary Quigley analyzed this and pointed out that it isn't just the heroic, victorious stories that build this resilience in kids.
Right, the peaks.
Yeah, the stories about grandpa winning a medal or mom getting a promotion, those are great. But the valleys, the failures, the intense regrets, the times your parents broke the rules or completely made a mess of things, those are arguably even more important for a child's psychological development.
It's all about developing empathy and self-acceptance. Think about it. If a child only ever hears curated stories about their ancestors' flawless victories and perfect morality, what happens when that child inevitably fails a test?
Or lies to a friend, or gets fired from a job.
Exactly. They will feel completely alienated. They will think, I am the broken link in this perfect chain.
They end up feeling like an imposter in their own family.
Yes. But if they have heard the stories about how a parent deeply regretted a college choice and had to start over, or how a grandparent failed spectacularly in a business venture but managed to keep the family fed, it models survival.
It models redemption.
It shows the child that failure, messiness, and mistakes are not the end of the narrative. They are just the valleys in a very long landscape.
That fundamentally answers those ultimate existential questions we all wrestle with late at night. Who am I and why am I here? We are hardwired to belong to a narrative that stretches beyond our own 80 or 90 years on this planet.
We really are.
But knowing the spoken stories, the oral histories, and the photo albums is only half the battle. What about the stories we don't even know we carry? The biological inheritance.
Oh, this is the wild part.
We are moving now from the psychological realm into the literal physical double helix.
This is where the landscape of family history has been radically altered in the last 2 decades. The science of consumer DNA testing has completely blown the lid off long-held family secrets.
Millions of people have spit into a tube, mailed it off, and received results that violently collide with the narratives they held dear their entire lives.
Dani Shapiro's memoir, Inheritance, is the quintessential example of this shock. She grew up with a very strong sense of identity, deeply connected to her father's heritage. But on a whim, she took a consumer DNA test. The results show that the man who raised her, the father she loved, mourned, and built her identity around, was not her biological father.
And imagine the structural collapse of your identity in that moment.
She had to dig deep into the medical practices of the past to understand what happened. She uncovered that her parents had gone to a fertility clinic in the early 1960s.
Okay.
At the time, it was a common, highly secretive practice at these clinics to mix the sperm of anonymous medical students with the husband's sperm. The idea was to give the parents plausible deniability so they could believe the child was biologically theirs.
Oh.
Her biological father turned out to be one of those anonymous medical student donors.
She wrote this incredibly haunting line about the experience. All my life I had known there was a secret. What I hadn't known the secret was me.
It's staggering. Your very existence is the unspoken truth the family is organized around.
It's heavy.
And DNA doesn't just reveal individual family secrets. It has proven massive historical rumors that persisted for centuries. For example, it was a long-standing rumor that founding father Thomas Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello.
Right.
For generations, many historians aggressively denied it to protect Jefferson's legacy. But the genetic code holds the truth. DNA testing finally proved the lineage, regardless of the historical stories we prefer to tell ourselves.
Well, the revelation of who we are related to is just the tip of the iceberg. DNA is now showing us what we have inherited through the rapidly advancing science of epigenetics.
Yes.
And we need to take a minute to really explain this because it sounds like science fiction, but it is biological reality. Epigenetics literally translates to over and above the genome.
Right. For generations, psychology and biology have debated team nature versus team nurture. Are you formed by your hardwired genetics, your eye color, your height, your baseline temperament? Or are you formed by your environment, how your parents raised you, the schools you attended, your socialization?
Epigenetics comes in and completely blurs that line because it proves that your environment actually dictates how your hardwired genetics behave.
To understand the mechanics of this, you have to realize that your DNA isn't just a fixed blueprint that builds a body and then stops. It's more like a massive control panel with millions of tiny switches.
Switches. Okay.
These switches are chemical tags, often methyl groups, that attach to the DNA and tell certain genes to turn on or turn off. Epigenetics is the study of how environmental factors like diet, toxins, and crucially extreme stress and trauma physically flip those switches.
And the groundbreaking part is that these switch positions can be passed down to the next generation. Information literally hitchhikes on top of our DNA.
Yes.
So DNA isn't just a static blueprint for a house. It's a tape recorder capturing the physical memory of the storms the house has weathered.
That is exactly how it functions. The classic, undeniable proof of this is the Hunger Winter Study.
Tell us about that.
During the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Netherlands experienced a horrific, artificially induced famine due to a German blockade. It's called the Dutch Hunger Winter. Pregnant women were surviving on sometimes less than 500 calories a day.
Oh my goodness.
Obviously, severely malnourished mothers gave birth to smaller babies with immediate health issues. That's standard biology.
But the epigenetic shock came decades later.
Yes. Scientists tracked the children born during that famine, and then they tracked their children, the grandchildren of the famine survivors. These grandchildren were born in the 1970s and 80s in a prosperous Europe with plenty of food. They had never experienced starvation,
Right.
yet they had significantly higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease compared to the general population.
How does a grandchild's body remember a famine that happened before their parents were even born?
Because the intense starvation of the grandmother physically altered the epigenetic switches in the developing fetus of her child. The grandmother's body basically sent a biological signal saying, the world is starving. Hold on to every single calorie. That switched-on metabolic adaptation was passed down in the germline to the grandchild. The memory of the metabolic stress was heritable. The grandchild's body was biologically hoarding calories for a famine that was over 30 years gone.
If physical starvation can alter the epigenetic code, then psychological and physical trauma absolutely does the same thing. And this applies profoundly to racial trauma and systemic oppression.
It absolutely does.
We have to look at the data here. Studies consistently show that Black newborns in the United States disproportionately present with lower birth weights and significantly higher baseline levels of cortisol.
Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone. It's what floods your system when you are in danger.
And scientists link this elevated baseline directly to the chronic, relentless hypervigilance required by their forebears to navigate centuries of historical and systemic racism.
That makes total sense biologically.
If your ancestors had to live in a constant state of threat assessment just to survive, their bodies adapted to constantly pump cortisol. That biological alarm system, that epigenetic switch stuck in the on position, is passed down. The trauma literally alters the biological baseline of the nervous system.
We see this exact phenomenon across many different populations that have faced ongoing catastrophic trauma. The book quotes Sherry Mitchell, an indigenous lawyer and activist from the Penobscot Nation.
Oh, her quote is so powerful.
She describes the inherited trauma echoing through indigenous communities, not just as a sociological disadvantage, but as a deep, agonizing soul pain that is felt in the body. It is an epigenetic resonance of the violence and displacement their ancestors endured.
Another powerful example is Myra Goodman. She's the child of Holocaust survivors. After the war, her parents chose a path of absolute silence. They never spoke about the camps, the loss, or the horrors they witnessed.
Their intent was protective, right? They thought by not speaking the words, they could protect their daughter from the trauma.
But the body speaks, even when the mouth is closed. Myra wrote about growing up living with what she called a constant low-grade terror.
Wow.
She was always anxiously awaiting a catastrophe, always scanning the horizon for a threat, even though she was raised in safety. She had biologically inherited the physical alterations caused by her parents' terror. The epigenetic switches were flipped, passing the trauma on, even in the complete absence of the narrative.
This is heavy, really heavy.
It is, and if I'm listening to this right now and I know my family history is riddled with trauma, poverty, or abuse, if I biologically inherit this trauma in my very cells, aren't I just doomed?
It feels like it.
Are we all just Ebenezer Scrooge standing in the graveyard, pointing a trembling finger at our own headstone, entirely bound by a tragic fate written into our genes before we took our first breath?
It is so easy to feel that kind of biological fatalism. It feels like a life sentence. But the author actually uses that exact Scrooge analogy to prove the opposite point.
Oh, how so?
When Scrooge looks at his gravestone, he asks the ghost of Christmas yet to come, "Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only?" Our past is our prologue. It is not our inevitable conclusion.
So the epigenetic code isn't locked in stone.
Far from it. The beautiful, hopeful flip side of epigenetics is neuroplasticity and epigenetic reversibility.
Reversibility.
Yes. Just as negative environments, toxic stress, and famine can rewrite the epigenetic script toward disease and hypervigilance, positive interventions physically rewrite the script back toward healing. Therapy, establishing safe environments, enforcing healthy boundaries, and building secure, loving relationships literally alter your gene expression.
You can turn the alarm bell off.
You can rewrite the script for yourself and critically for the generations that follow you.
And there's a stunning theological point the author makes here to anchor that hope. Alongside any inherited trauma, any flipped genetic switches, we carry the imago Dei, the image of God, in our DNA.
Yes, that is crucial.
What that means conceptually is that your intrinsic worth, your dignity, and your capacity for wholeness can never be permanently erased by a genetic mutation, a history of systemic oppression, or a great-grandfather's terrible choices. The core of who you are remains intact beneath the trauma.
That concept provides a crucial foundation of ultimate hope as we shift from the biological realm into the behavioral realm.
Right.
Because we need to look at how these epigenetic and historical wounds actually play out in our daily actions.
Right. How does an inherited trauma show up when you're just trying to get through a Tuesday?
Exactly. This brings us to the ripple effects, the generational consequences.
Let's look at the story of a woman named Ingrid. It's a powerful testament to self-awareness. Ingrid caught herself in a terrifying moment. She was being physically and verbally abusive to her own toddler.
Oof.
In a flash of clarity, she realized she was in active danger to her child, and she proactively picked up the phone and called Child Protective Services on herself.
That takes a level of immense, agonizing courage that is hard to even fathom. To report yourself.
Absolutely, but when you map Ingrid's lineage, her behavior wasn't spontaneous. It reads like a clinical textbook on generational trauma. Ingrid was born to a 19-year-old runaway mother.
And why did her mother run away? To escape her own father, who was deeply abusive and an alcoholic?
Yet despite running away, Ingrid's mother ended up slapping Ingrid when she was a toddler. The physical reaction was hardwired. So when Ingrid lashed out at her own child, she was literally acting out the exact, unhealed, untranslated wound of her mother and her grandfather. The script is just playing itself out.
And what makes translating these scripts so difficult is that families often mask these profound wounds with elaborate family myths. The myth acts as a shield.
Yes, like the Patrick McKenna story.
Exactly. There's a story in the book about Patrick McKenna, an Irish immigrant who fled the devastation of the potato famine. The family myths passed down through the generations paints Patrick as this heroic, larger-than-life figure. The story is that he came to America with $2 in his pocket, worked grueling hours on the railroads, built a life from nothing, and was a paragon of pluck and work ethic.
But the reality beneath that shiny myth is devastating and far more instructive. The potato famine wasn't just a tough time. It was an apocalyptic event that claimed over 1 million lives, including members of Patrick's own family.
It was horrific.
He faced a disease-ridden voyage across the Atlantic. When he arrived, he faced extreme systemic discrimination in America. He lived with a crushing, unrelenting homesickness for a world that no longer existed. He didn't just pull himself up by his bootstraps. He found his solace and his survival in alcohol.
And because he had no tools to process that immense grief, he passed the unprocessed trauma right down the generational line. The consequences were severe.
Yeah, his kids really paid for it.
One of his daughters ended up marrying an alcoholic, repeating the dynamic she grew up with. One of his sons went to prison. The family myth celebrated the work ethic, but completely ignored the emotional fallout.
As the counselor Mark Woolen notes, when pain is too great for a person to hold, they avoid it. But that pain doesn't disappear. It submerges and finds pathways for expression in the next generation. One generation's unprocessed grief becomes the next generation's unexplainable rage, addiction, or crippling anxiety.
And on an individual psychological level, this unprocessed pain often results in what Arlene Legerson calls inner vows.
I found this concept completely fascinating. An inner vow is a binding, unconscious promise you make to yourself in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. It's that voice inside you that shouts, "Never again." and builds a rigid behavioral rule to ensure you never feel that specific pain again.
We all have them, and they usually form in childhood or young adulthood. The author's own mother is a prime example of how destructive an inner vow can become.
What happened?
Shortly before her wedding, her mother learned a deeply traumatic secret. She had been adopted, and everyone had lied to her about it her entire life. In response to that massive betrayal, she built an emotional fortress. She made a powerful inner vow to never forgive. She fundamentally believed that keeping everyone at a distance, holding grudges, and refusing to extend grace was the only way to protect herself from ever being rejected, lied to, or hurt again.
But the vow became a prison. The wall she built to keep the pain out became the wall that kept love from getting in.
Precisely.
It impacted everyone around her, especially her children, who had to navigate her rigid unforgiveness. The Bible actually addresses this exact kind of generational ripple effect. There is a passage that describes God punishing sins to the third and fourth generation. Now, to our modern ears, that sounds incredibly vindictive and harsh. Why punish a great-grandchild?
But the author clarifies that this is a Hebrew idiom. It's not about a lightning bolt of divine retribution striking a toddler. It means for as long as it takes for the natural destructive consequences of a toxic action to fully play out.
Ah, I see.
If a grandfather is a violent alcoholic, the structural and emotional damage of that will naturally cascade through the family for 3 or 4 generations before someone manages to stop it. But the text beautifully contrasts that reality by stating that God shows mercy to 1,000 generations.
It's illustrating the contrast between the lingering, painful half-life of human trauma and the infinite, expansive reach of grace.
Yeah.
And practically, the first step in translating that trauma and stopping the cycle is identifying the lie at the very root of your inner vow. Let's say your inner vow is, I must look perfect and perform flawlessly to be loved. You have to identify the underlying lie that your worth is conditional on your output before you can begin to dismantle the vow.
You have to interrogate the vows you've made to yourself.
But let me play devil's advocate here. Let's talk about personal accountability.
Let's do it.
If I have a terrible temper, and I now know that I can trace it back to my great-grandfather Patrick's unprocessed grief from the potato famine, or if my inability to commit to a relationship is tied to my mother's inner vow of unforgiveness, doesn't this entire framework just let me off the hook for my own bad behavior?
It sounds like an excuse.
Right. Can I just say, hey, sorry I yelled at you, it's my epigenetics acting up?
It is a totally fair question, but the distinction is critical. Generational trauma explains the wound. It absolutely does not excuse the behavior. You are still entirely 100% responsible for your healing and your actions in the present moment.
Okay, that makes sense.
Understanding the why behind your parents' behavior or your own knee-jerk reactions allows you to replace self-hatred with compassion. It allows compassion to overshadow the old hurts. But it does not give you a free pass to cause harm to others.
You don't get to pass the hot potato just because someone handed it to you.
Exactly. You have to take responsibility for stopping the cycle, just like Ingrid did by calling Child Protective Services when she realized she was repeating the abuse. She owned her behavior, even while understanding its origin.
But here is the massive roadblock so many people hit. How do we take responsibility and heal when we don't even have the full story? What if the ancestors are long gone, the records burned in a courthouse fire, and the trauma is buried so deep nobody talks about it?
That happens all the time.
We have to learn how to read the silences.
This brings us to one of the most compelling concepts in the book, the idea of negative space.
To explain this, the author uses a fantastic pop culture reference. She talks about a cellular network commercial from a few years ago featuring Gwen Stefani and Adam Levine.
Oh, I remember this one.
Right. They are talking on the phone, and Stefani is describing the exact kind of partner she wants to meet. She says, I want someone completely different, maybe from another country, someone cultured and sensitive and not threatened by a strong, confident woman. It's a great list.
The connection drops.
Yes. Because they are on a bad cellular network, the connection drops key words right in the middle of her sentences.
So what Adam Levine actually hears on his end is, I want someone, country, uncultured, and threatened by a strong, confident woman. And based on that drastically altered information, he sets her up with Blake Shelton.
It's a brilliant, hilarious commercial, but it perfectly illustrates a terrifying reality, how missing information drastically, completely alters our perception of reality. The negative space, the dropped words, changes the entire message of the transmission.
In art and design, negative space is the empty space around and between the subjects of an image. A design blog called Framer notes a crucial philosophical point about this. On its own, negative space is nothing. It exists only in relation to positive space.
Right, you only see a gap because there are distinct objects surrounding it forming a boundary.
Exactly. In genealogy and family history, negative space is the silence between the census records. It's the unexplained 10-year estrangement between two brothers. It's the empty chair at a holiday table that nobody is allowed to mention.
Think about your own family holidays. Who isn't there? And why doesn't anyone talk about it? That is your family's negative space.
And on a macro level, these gaps are often created by massive, violent, historical events.
The book discusses how forced migrations, ethnic cleansings, and wars act as scythes through family trees. Think about the Franco-Syrian War, the Western Sahara War, the Armenian Genocide, the horrors in Rwanda and Bosnia, the ongoing Uyghur Genocide in China.
These geopolitical forces violently sever lineages, leaving behind massive, unbridgeable silences.
And the key insight here is that those untraceable ancestors or those missing records are not just missing data. The silence is not empty. It is an active, heavy component of the family story.
A good translator doesn't try to forcefully invent happy answers to shove into that silence just to feel closure. A good translator learns to sit in conversation with the silence itself.
The author uses the metaphor of a weaver's loom, which really helped me visualize this. If you look at a loom, you have the warp and the weft. The warp threads are the strong, stationary threads pulled tight across the frame. These represent the major historical events like the American Revolution, the Potato Famine, or the Civil Rights Movement. The weft is the moving thread that the weaver passes over and under the warp. The weft represents the specific individual decisions our ancestors made in response to those massive historical events.
The pattern only emerges when the two interact. You cannot possibly understand why the moving thread darted left or right if you don't look at the stationary historical threads it was reacting to. Why did your great-grandmother suddenly move across the country in 1942? You have to look at the warp of World War II to understand the weft of her personal choice.
It's like looking at a constellation in the night sky. The darkness between the stars is what actually gives the shape its meaning. Without the dark negative space, the sky would just be a blinding, unreadable sheet of light.
That's a beautiful analogy.
But practically speaking, I have to ask, how do you actually translate a silence when there is literally no one left alive to ask? You can't interrogate an empty chair.
Sometimes the act of translation is simply recognizing the shape of the gap, acknowledging that an ancestor had to flee a war and that their terror was real, even if you don't know the details.
Just validating the space.
Right. Acknowledging that a painful estrangement occurred that you will never fully understand, but validating the sorrow it caused. Recognizing the gap is the story. It honors the reality of their life without forcing a neat conclusion.
Wow.
And there is one specific type of family dynamic where gaps, missing pieces, and negative space are completely foundational to the daily narrative, the incredibly complex constellation of adoption.
This is such an important, sensitive section of the book. Let's look at the sheer scale of it first. In the United States, about 2% of all children are adopted, and within that, roughly 40% of those are transracial or cross-cultural adoptions.
That is millions of people whose origin story involves a profound severing and grafting.
And it is crucial to recognize that every single member of the adoption constellation, the birth parents, the adoptive parents, and the adoptee themselves, faces a unique, overlapping set of challenges. The book highlights what psychologists call the 7 core issues of adoption.
These are loss, rejection, shame and guilt, grief, identity, intimacy, and mastery and control.
Let's deeply unpack these because they don't just exist on paper, they dictate lives. Loss is the foundational reality of adoption. Even in the most beautiful, loving adoption story, it fundamentally begins with a severance from biological origins.
Rejection often follows, where the adoptee perceives that initial loss as a personal failing, a deep-seated fear of abandonment that can haunt relationships decades later.
Then there is shame and guilt. This often plagues both sides. Birth parents may feel immense guilt for relinquishing the child, and adoptees often internalize the sense that they are inherently flawed, that they were somehow given away because they weren't good enough.
Grief is tied right to that. And it's a very complex grief because it is often disenfranchised. It's the mourning of a life, a culture, or a biological mirror that never was.
Identity is obvious but profoundly difficult. It is the struggle to integrate the missing pieces of a broken narrative into a cohesive self.
Intimacy becomes a minefield when a person at their core fears that connection inevitably leads to further loss.
And finally, mastering control. I think this is the hidden engine for a lot of the others. It's the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that comes from having the entire trajectory of your life changed by adult decisions made when you were entirely helpless. So you try to hyper-control your environment as an adult to compensate.
It is a staggering psychological load to carry, but the book offers beautiful narratives of how people navigate this. It shares the story of Anna. Her origin is incredibly traumatic. She was conceived in rape and subsequently adopted. Yet Anna has done the hard work of translation. She views her very existence, the fact that she is here, breathing and living a full life, as a profound testimony to God's expansive imagination for redemption. She sees her life as a restoration of what was broken.
And then there's Rhiannon's story, which tackles that incredibly ignorant, insensitive question adoptees constantly get asked: are those your real parents?
Yes.
Rhiannon has a fascinating story because her birth mother actually lived with her adoptive family for a brief time when Rhiannon was a preschooler. Because of that open, sprawling, honest family dynamic, Rhiannon's definition of real became beautifully expansive. Her real family encompasses both her biological roots and the parents who raised her. It's not an either-or equation for her.
The biblical history actually places a massive emphasis on adoption. Look at Moses, fostered by Pharaoh's daughter, navigating a dual identity. Look at Abram, who was essentially chosen by God to build a brand new nation, a spiritual adoption meant for redemptive purposes.
But where the author dives really deep is into the theological and psychological weight of the fifth commandment. Honor your father and your mother.
Yes, this is where translation requires immense grace and sometimes difficult boundaries. The Hebrew word used for honor in that commandment is kabed. It literally translates to a heavy, great weight.
Right. It's actually the same root word often used throughout the Old Testament to describe the glory of God. It implies giving profound weight and significance to something.
But the immediate, agonizing question for many is, how do you honor a parent who is physically abusive, intensely toxic, or completely absent? Or, in the case of adoption, a birth parent you've literally never met.
It is a razor's edge to walk. The author is very careful to specify that honoring does not mean submitting to further abuse. It does not mean giving a toxic parent unfettered access to your children or your life.
Exactly. To honor them means acknowledging their full, flawed humanity. It means recognizing the heavy reality that they, too, are the product of their own broken family histories and unhealed traumas.
You can honor the objective fact that they gave you life, while simultaneously establishing healthy, firm, even absolute boundaries to protect your own well-being.
Precisely. Boundaries protect the translation work.
But I want to push back on the premise of the 7 core issues we just discussed. If an adoptee wrestles deeply with feelings of rejection or complex grief when they are 25 or 30 years old, does that mean the adoption itself was a failure? Does it mean the adoptive parents failed to love them enough, or did something structurally wrong?
It's a common fear, but the answer is absolutely not. Grief, loss, and identity struggles are inherently baked into the adoption experience, even in the most profoundly loving, supportive, psychologically aware adoptive families on Earth.
So it's not a failure.
Acknowledging those core issues playing out isn't pointing out a failure. It's simply recognizing the reality of the emotional landscape. And that intense complexity of identity, figuring out where you belong, who your people are, and how you fit in when your roots are complicated, bridges directly into the broader societal groups we all belong to. It scales up to race, ethnicity, and religion.
The author opens this broader section with a classic, fantastic quote from Groucho Marx: "Please accept my resignation. I don't care to belong to any club that will accept me as a member."
It's a great joke.
It is, but the underlying point is serious. When it comes to our genetic and historical clubs, we cannot resign. We are born into them, and they shape how the world interacts with us.
And she does a very necessary job of defining the difference between race and ethnicity, because in common conversation, we constantly conflate the two.
Yeah, we use them interchangeably.
Race, as it operates in society, is understood primarily as a mixture of physical characteristics and social constructs. It is how society categorizes you, largely based on your outward appearance and historical power dynamics. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is a shared internal identity based on language, traditions, geography, and culture.
And to prove that race is heavily a social construct, you just have to look at history. The racial categories shift dramatically over time.
Very true.
100 years ago in the United States, Irish and Italian immigrants were decidedly not considered white by the ruling class. They were completely marginalized and racialized. Today, they are seamlessly folded into the white category. The genetics didn't change, the social construct changed.
And this is a massive, but the book highlights just because race is a fluid social construct does not mean it doesn't have brutal real-world impacts on people's daily lives.
Exactly. You cannot ignore the construct just because it's invented. The author quotes Ashley McCall, a brilliant educator who talks about the profound harm of claiming colorblindness.
We hear this all the time from well-meaning people. I don't see race, I just see the human.
Right. McCall points out that if you say, I don't see race, what you are essentially communicating to a person of color is, I don't see you, I don't truly know you, and I am not willing to acknowledge or believe the daily reality of your life.
Jaron Kim's story in the book illustrates this perfectly and heartbreakingly. She is a transracial Korean adoptee raised by white parents. She noted that her parents loved her deeply with a colorblind love.
Okay.
And inside the safety of their home, that love was beautiful, but it left her completely, dangerously unprepared for the racial realities she faced the second she stepped out of that bubble, went to college, and entered the adult world. Love alone wasn't enough. She needed explicit racial and cultural identity support to navigate a world that definitely did see her race.
Ethnic identity has to be actively built. It is built through conscious awareness, self-identification, and physical behaviors. It's carried in the silent traditions of a home.
Think about food. Why does one family passionately spend 2 days making gefilte fish for a holiday, while the neighbors up the street are meticulously preparing lutefisk?
Those aren't just meals.
No. Those small, specific cultural markers silently teach a child who our people are and where the boundaries of their specific community lie.
And religious identity acts in the exact same way. It binds people together across biological lines. There is a beautiful, unexpected quote in the book from Susan Sarandon's character in the movie Shall We Dance?
Oh, I love that movie.
She's talking about marriage, and she says, we get married because we need a witness to our lives. We need someone to notice the mundane Tuesday mornings, the good moments, the terrible moments. We need someone to say, your life will not go unnoticed because I will notice it.
That's profound.
The author takes that profound need for a witness and applies it to the local faith community.
Which is an incredibly vital function today, perhaps more than ever. Sociologically, there are over 36 million Americans living entirely alone right now. The epidemic of loneliness is staggering.
Wow, 36 million.
Yes. For millions of people who are estranged from their biological families or simply have no living relatives, the religious community, the local church, or the chosen family steps in to act as that familial witness. They provide the connective tissue that biology usually handles.
Let me push back on this whole concept of group identity, though. Given how much violence, genocide, systemic oppression, and bitter division is caused globally by clinging to racial and religious group identities, wouldn't society just be vastly better off if we abandon these categories entirely?
Just wipe the slate clean.
Right. What if we genuinely strove to treat everyone as a completely blank slate individual human being, completely stripped of historical context? Wouldn't that solve the division?
It is a deeply tempting thought, especially when you look at the news. But erasing our distinct cultural threads doesn't actually create unity. It just creates erasure. It flattens the beautiful, complex diversity of the human experience into a sterile monoculture.
So it doesn't solve the problem.
The Apostle Paul addressed this tension beautifully in his letters to Galatia. He was dealing with intense ethnic divisions between Jews and Gentiles. But he didn't tell people to erase their cultural differences or pretend they didn't exist. He established that despite those very real differences, everyone stood on equal, beloved footing in a shared humanity. True healing doesn't come from pretending we are all the same blank slate. It comes from acknowledging our diverse, sometimes bloody threads and doing the incredibly hard, painful work of forgiveness.
Forgiveness. That is the absolute hardest part of translating the past. And we have to be incredibly precise here because the word is so often abused.
Very true.
The author is very clear. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not developing amnesia about what happened to you. And it is absolutely not the immediate restoration of blind trust to an abuser.
No, not at all. Forgiveness in this context is a targeted internal release. It is recognizing the exact size and shape of the debt someone owes you for the harm they caused. And then it is making the conscious choice to release the offender from the obligation to repay what they took from you.
Releasing the debt.
Yes. Not because they deserve it, but because holding on to that debt, demanding repayment from someone who is perhaps dead or incapable of change, is actively destroying your own soul.
The author quotes the theologian Lewis Smedes, who phrased it perfectly. He said, "Forgiving what we cannot forget creates a new way to remember. We change the memory of our past into a hope for our future.
That is beautiful.
And the ultimate cosmic model for this kind of release is Jesus on the cross. In the midst of being actively murdered, he says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." It is the ultimate release of an unpayable debt.
And this is where the translation work finally pays off. When we do that agonizingly hard work of releasing the pain and forgiving the debt, we finally clear enough space in our hearts to translate the gifts of our history. Because our family stories are not solely comprised of trauma and pain.
Right. There is beauty buried in the dirt. The author had this wonderful moment of discovery where she found photos of her grandmother, Molly's Yiddish theater troupe performing in Poland back in the 1920s.
I love that part.
By uncovering those photos and that history, Michelle realized that her own lifelong drive for creativity and storytelling wasn't just a random fluke. It was a generational gift passed down directly from Molly. She inherited the art just as surely as she inherited the trauma.
Or look at the incredible story of Pharrell Williams on the PBS show Finding Your Roots. The host, Henry Louis Gates Jr., presented Farrell with the actual written slave narrative of his great-great-aunt, Jane Arrington.
Oh, this story is intense.
As Farrell read her words, detailing the absolute horror and dehumanization of slavery, he was so emotionally overwhelmed that they actually had to stop filming. The pain was too visceral.
Wow.
But when he finally processed the translation of that document, he didn't just walk away with trauma. He resolved to use his massive global platform and his voice to honor her immense, unbelievable courage. He took the pain and translated it into purpose.
Which perfectly summarizes the ultimate goal of all this translation work. The goal is to move from simply collecting data like you were dusting off and reading an old, dry encyclopedia to actively, intentionally curating a legacy.
Yes, curating.
You have to be willing to sift through the mud and the dysfunction, to find the resilience, the deep curiosity, the honesty, and the courage hidden in your lineage. You pull those threads forward.
And here's the truly mind-bending part of this whole equation. The internal, emotional work you are doing today, the therapy you go to, the boundaries you set to process your grandfather's trauma. It doesn't just heal you.
No.
It will literally, behaviorally, and epigenetically change the physical baseline of your great-grandchildren. You are stopping the buck. You are changing the code.
So forgiveness and translation aren't about deleting a corrupted file from a computer's hard drive. You can't delete the history. It's about changing the file permissions so that the corrupted file can no longer run malicious code in the background of your operating system.
I love that analogy. You acknowledge the file exists, but you strip it of its executive power to cause harm. And by doing that, it allows you to pass on something beautiful instead. The author ends with this evocative thought. The songs of our ancestors are also the songs of our children.
The songs of our children.
We are the translator standing in the middle. Our job is to ensure that the beautiful melody carries on, but we have to filter out the static.
What an incredible, challenging journey. Translating Your Past by Michelle Van Loon is truly essential reading. Whether you feel stuck in an unexplainable cycle of anxiety or anger, or you're just deeply curious about your roots and why you do the things you do, or you desperately want to ensure you leave a healthier emotional inheritance for your kids, this book completely shifts your view of the past.
It really does.
It takes it out of the dusty, static museum and turns it into an active, living, breathing dialogue that you are participating in right now.
It equips you with the tools to finally read and understand the prologue of your own life.
So to you, our listener, here is a final, mind-expanding thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We've spent this entire deep dive looking backward, analyzing how the ancestors who came before shaped the exact contours of who we are.
But flip that lens entirely around.
What if the exact mundane moment you are living right now is the distant past for someone else? What micro decisions of courage, what healthy boundaries, what agonizing acts of forgiveness are you choosing to make today that will epigenetically and behaviorally alter the life of a great-grandchild you will never even meet?
You are writing their prologue right now. Make it a good one.
Make sure to subscribe to the Book Nook so you never miss a deep dive into these transformative works. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us which book you'd like us to explore next. We read every single one.